Lyndon Norley, welcome to the DCQ podcast special sits. Great to have you on. How are you?
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm very well, and thank you for inviting me to this podcast. I'm
Excellent.
not sure whether this is sort of partially a confessional or a psychiatric therapy treatment, but we'll see how this goes.
We'll see how it goes. To me, Lyndon, it really is a little bit, because it's sort of, it allows you to reflect on your own sort of, journey so far. And actually, if you can exchange these experiences with somebody who's been in the weeds as well, it helps you sort of focus on your own journey. So we'll see what happens, but I'm not
Indeed.
qualified in that respect. By the way, maybe as
Well,
a heads up,
and I have never done either, so I'm not quite sure why I thought it may be either of those.
But you just give it a go, whatever works. So you're joining us from South Africa, right? From
Indeed.
Cape Town, just outside Cape Town.
Just outside, yeah.
So that's your adopted home country, I understand. I had the pleasure of obviously, catching up with you over a delicious lunch in Cape Town last November. And I want to go into, how you discovered that part of the world. But maybe we can start at the beginning. I understand that you grew up in the UK. Was that in London, outside of London?
Yeah, so a very long time ago now, but yeah, so in the southeast corner of the UK, so southeast of London by around 25-30 miles. Um, yeah, it's the county of Kent. It's called the Garden of England, and to the extent anything can be in England, I guess it's sort of semi-rural. And we'll come back on to that's probably my background, and it's what I like. I guess I'm not an urbanite to that extent, although, yeah, having studied, worked in London for a long time, I think my sort of good place is probably more sort of semi-countryside.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, what I would like to sort of do is see how, when, and why you decided to pursue a career in the law that, subsequently, got you into the special sit space. Was that
hmm
something that, you sort of decided yourself? Was it influenced heavily by maybe your dad, your family? Are you part of a lawyer's family, or you were sort of a trailblazer in this space?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd call myself a trailblazer. Maybe an outlier is maybe. No one in the legal profession in my family at all. Uh, I think it's one of those odd things. I mean, you're sitting at school and you sort of look at sort of what careers may be sensible, what may sort of suit your skill sets and your characteristics. And law, although I must admit I didn't really know anything about it, sort of seemed something that I could potentially do. I mean, very generic. I mean, we're talking mid 70s or something, and we'll speak to this. But I mean, law in those days, as far as I understood it at all, which was very little, was your high street lawyer who was sort of general practitioner who did sort of everything, the person you'd come across, from time to time in one's life. But I saw that was, it was looked like a prestigious profession, something that I thought I could do. So from a relatively early age, I thought that looks a possibility. That's something to pursue.
And but you didn't go to you didn't study law. You actually studied history, I understand.
Yeah, well, I started law, and so that was the intention. I was sort of very rigid in my thinking. Again, I think in those days, if you wanted to be a lawyer, pretty much it was go do a law degree. And I started, and then some personal circumstances happened that I left university. Took 2 years off, did some work, which I think was actually very important for me. And then went back to university, a different university, and a different course. I think I still had the idea that I wanted to be a lawyer, but that was slightly on the back burner at that point. And I went back to university to do something I was fundamentally very interested in. And that was it was modern history, and I did as well as British and European, all modern history. I did political thought and a lot of South American history as well. And I guess that, as we jump forward, that sort of began to sort of increase my ideas about, that there's a world outside of England.
The island is an island, but there's a lot around it, and maybe
Yes, indeed.
worthwhile exploring. So what work did you do when you were sort of taking a step back and then coming back to university? Because
Yeah.
I've heard others people sort of do that, through circumstances, and it grounds you well. It also gives you maybe even more motivation than to pick up the studies again because you've seen a little bit what it is without.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the negatives. So maybe this is sort of quite a life lesson. I think sometimes the negatives are sometimes better at teaching you things. And I did a number of things. Most of it was to fund myself going back to university. So it's a question of building up some funds. But I worked in a bank, pretty junior sort of stuff, obviously. I worked in a travel agency. I did some accountancy work. And the lesson, I say, and all those were sort of fine, and some of them were quite good fun. The lesson I learned, though, was there was like a glass ceiling. If you did not have a degree, there was a limit of where you was going to go with any of this, which I actually found, I think I still find, fundamentally incorrect. Um, but I got to the sort of point of it doesn't matter what your brain is. You need a piece of paper. And it was literally go get the piece of paper, and then people will give you entry to different occupations and different opportunities. And I still find that sort of getting the pieces of paper sort of slightly odd or just limited in people's management. And look, there's dozens, hundreds of examples out there about people who dropped out of university, Bill Gates, etc. Shows that you don't need the piece of paper, but it's very difficult, and it's understandable. People, if you're faced with 100 people, you don't want to interview 100 people. You will adopt some form of sifting process, and an easy one is: do you have a degree? And do you have a degree from a limited number of universities, probably? And you sort of narrow it down. I think it's a very arbitrary way of doing things, but understandable. So fundamentally, I realized through that hang on, I'm not going to achieve what I wanted to achieve until I went back and got the requisite piece of paper. But it seemed to me to be get a piece of paper. It didn't really quite matter what it was in, and so partially that was, well, okay, go and do a degree that you're fundamentally really interested in. And then, somewhat fortuitously, maybe there's a lot of fortune comes along. Um, Literally, very quickly back into that university life. I got back into, yes, I want to be a lawyer, and then I realised that you could uh, be a non-law degree person. You could do a conversion course, and you sort of effectively did the core legal subjects in a year, and then you went on to what was called law society final. So um, and actually, a whole number of people have gone through that route. And I think there was a period of time in the law, perhaps it still stands, that having people with different degrees was something that was probably beneficial rather than this sort of homogenous, one size fits all type approach. It was certainly those sort of interviewing in late 80s was, okay, this is quite interesting. We've got some people that have done science degrees or they've done other things, because again, I think, yeah, law was fundamentally massively changing in the late 80s, and clients were changing enormously. And having people with a broader background, broader skill sets, I think was seen as something that was very helpful. And I think I was sort of right place, right time to that extent.
And you said at the outset that one of the things you were attracted to with law was also that it was prestigious. Uh, um, was it at that point in time still the case that quote unquote class was important as well to actually make your way into, I guess, the profession, or was that not something that was an obstacle or barrier in any way, shape, or form?
Uh, I think those barriers were coming down. I certainly think they existed, um, but there were holes in those barriers, and I think that happened really. Yeah, you had the big bang in the city. I think it was 85 or something, and that sort of changed the sort of the city and finance. And I think law came sort of slightly behind that curve, but there were more opportunities. I think, maybe if I'd wanted to be a lawyer 10 years earlier, it would have been, yeah, not necessarily impossible, but incredibly difficult. So again, sort of right time, that sort of late 80s, where when I was interviewed, I think there were more opportunities. And yeah, I also think, I mean, the firm I joined, and I must admit, it's quite funny when I heard of people later interviewing just a ridiculous number of firms, and perhaps that's what you have to do. I mean, I interviewed at three, um, and was fortunate enough to receive an offer from two of those. But the one, and the firm I chose was what is now, and has been for a long time, Clifford Chance. But that had, I think, when I interviewed, maybe they'd just done their merger a year before. So these were two, large-ish but not that large firms joining together and then becoming, something quite new and something much bigger. And they, as a firm, to my mind, I think almost, to a person in the firm, it was very different from, those established firms. It was very different from a Slaughter and May, a Linklaters, a Freshfields, etc. And again, that I think suited me. And they were, I think as a firm was, okay, we're new, we're now this much bigger firm, and with the timing, finance going crazy. It was, complete gangbusters about, the way, and in sort of the 90s as a whole. So it was like, it was a very dynamic, exciting place to be.
And so you studied at King's College. It wasn't
Yeah.
Oxbridge, so that
No.
wasn't again a problem for you to get into one of the very small number of magic circle firms.
No, I think that was fine. Obviously, I mean, a very large percentage of people were Oxbridge, but there was a limited number, and thankfully, King's London was one of those. But a limited number of other institutions that were, deemed by the powers to be to be vaguely acceptable, I think.
And did you sort of, was there a theory behind going to King's College, or was it just you ended up there or you got an offer there and made sense?
Um, I did get an offer there, so that's fine. But I only applied. I only applied to colleges within London University. I decided that I was a southerner at the end of the day, and being a southerner was where I wanted to be. And yeah, I also didn't want, although I can see the advantages of it maybe now, a lot later on. I didn't really want to be part of that sort of student body. And London, for good or for bad, Yeah, it is not that. Yeah, it is not a university town. It's not a university campus, which can be, has a lot of issues, problems potentially with it. But for me, it was like, okay, I can go in, I can do my stuff, and I can leave. And it was very much sort of a transactional type thing, but it suited me at the time.
It's interesting because, yeah, I grew up in the southwest, also very rural in the Netherlands, and for almost similar reasons as you, I decided to go to Rotterdam as opposed to the student towns like Leiden or Utrecht, exactly for
Mm,
the same reason. It's like I don't want to sort of be only in a student town. I want to be in something bigger than just that. And obviously, in the Netherlands, everything is small. But Rotterdam was, in comparison to where I
mm.
came from, huge. So that was so London had that attraction for you as well.
Yeah, and
So
and
then,
then and then I sort of used to joke with people that whilst I globe trotted to some extent subsequently, there was a period of time where going to university in London, going to law school in London, and then working in London. I think there was with a couple of gaps for sort of 20 odd years. I studied and worked within about a 1 mile radius.
right, right. So was that a big change for you? Having grown up, I guess more in the countryside, rural, as you said, and then all of a sudden, being probably in the one of the cities of the world, London. Big change.
No, I don't think it was. I mean, I'm very much someone who sort of compartmentalizes my life, and I think, yeah, there was growing up. That was that phase, and then there was, embarking upon a career, and the sort of precursor to that was sort of studying, and yeah, that was the London thing. And I guess I'm now at a different phase of being in a completely different country, but yeah, there's a time and a place, and for me, it doesn't have to be a sort of continuous process. It can be, you can quite package these things up, and London and being in London was exactly the right thing for me. I think it's what I wanted, and I think it's proved to be the right thing.
Yeah. And then, going into private practice was, what you had your mind on. You never considered going, to the bar or, going immediately in house. It was very much, I want to be a private practice lawyer. Was at that point in time already in your mind, a specialization in, I guess, special sits? Or how did that come about?
uh, this is the story of my life, I guess. The sort of the negatives again rather than the positives. So, look, I was incredibly pleased to be offered a position at Clifford Chance. I say there was sort of a new firm, a combined firm, very dynamic, and known for its banking, and the city was going gangbusters on financing. So I thought, finance lawyer, yeah, that's the thing to be at the sort of the cutting edge of things. And I mean, look, undoubtedly, I did not give it enough time, but my first 6 months at Clever were in banking. I thought absolutely fantastic. I've hit the ground running, and it was it was a challenge. Look, in and thankfully, I don't think any lawyers have to do the sort of real grunt work that we did in those days. But I just thought, wow, this is pretty tedious, which is fine as a junior person. But the thought I also had was, and I don't think I've changed this, was uh, as a banking lawyer, and I apologize to all the banking lawyers that might listen to this now. And I always say I'm glad they want to do it because I didn't want to do it. I felt just at a personal level that as a banking lawyer, you were not at the main table. And by that, I mean that, yeah, there is a transaction that's going on where finance is needed. But to my mind, that discussion, that table, was between the potential borrower and the potential lender or lenders. And it gets papered up subsequently, and then there's a separate table where the lawyers are sort of arguing through the 100 odd page document, whatever. And I just thought, yeah, I understand all of that. I understand the need for it. says he as a lawyer. Obviously, you need that paperwork, but it wasn't. I didn't find that the most exciting thing. So that first seat was where, okay, this is what I've studied for? Is this going to be my career? This isn't what I thought it was going to be. Then my second seat was in litigation, and it was sort of really between property and litigation. And thankfully, I got litigation around property because I think that would have been another 6 months of torture. And it was sort of okay. It was more interesting. And at the time, that involved a lot of litigation was around. Again, Clifford Chance was always acting for the banks. So this was acting where property development companies, there is a sort of bubble of property development late 80s, massive over leveraging of property values, and it all going wrong. So there's a lot of that, a lot of construction and property litigation, and that was all fine. I felt, and people who know me will know me for saying this, I wasn't so keen on the fact that you had to be incredibly circumspect about everything you said, you wrote, because it could well end up in, being read out in court. That was the thing of everything you say may well be repeated back to you in court. And I just thought that I guess was a bit more of a freewheeling is one term. People could use others. And I thought, okay, I understand all of this, but I'm not sure that's quite me. But then halfway through that seat, there was an opportunity. And I've repeated this to many people. There was an opportunity where I was asked by the senior partner to go with him, to which he said, it was a bank that was not a client of Clifford Chance. They seemed to have some problems. Would I go along? Which was interesting. He even asked me, would I go along? I think it was like a 5:30 on a Friday afternoon, which in those days was definitely the beginning of the weekend, and there was no mobile phones or anything. So it was definitely the weekend. Anyway, long story short, I went along, and the entire board was there, and they relayed the problems that they had found that day, which was effectively an enormous fraud that was seriously challenging the ability of the bank to stay in business. And this went on for 2 or 3 hours, and the full explanation. And at the end, and I won't repeat the details of it, but the short of it is where my the senior boss then made a comment about, okay, this is where we are, which sort of shocked them, which was, you are not in a very good place. In fact, you're in a very bad place. But then immediately set out what needed to be done, and gave them an enormous amount of assurance about that. And the job went on for months and months. But that split second of where I could see that this board were waiting on every word that he said. And I just thought, wow, that's a position where the lawyer is at the center of this, as the absolute fulcrum point about what's going to happen. Because I've always said, companies make widgets or whatever, they don't understand insolvency. They don't understand restructuring. As equally, they don't understand litigation. Again, I think the litigators are sort of at the head of that sort of transaction. And so one thought, okay, you're really at the main table here. And I also, and as it played out, and I saw that it brought a number of skill sets together. You weren't just doing, and I'm sorry to say that again, a bank doc or a property transaction. It was all over the place. There would be finance, there'd be corporate stuff, there'd be litigation, and it was back to sort of, I think, that sort of holistic business approach that I guess I'd had in my mind of that would be a good thing to do. So that was that, and it was just in a training seat. I then went and did a couple of other training seats and was offered a position back into that group. And the group was just litigation at the time. And whilst I was in my third and fourth seats, and my fourth seat was in Singapore, when I came back, the litigation department had a part of the litigation department had joined with part of the corporate department and created a brand new restructuring insolvency group. So I joined that group, literally on the sort of month, whatever it started.
Wow. So at inception of, I guess, a more specialized group that combined various, I guess, traditional departments, you were right there. So the
Yeah, and
senior
I'm
partner.
not sure. I'm not sure any other firm had that. I mean, thinking of sort of who was sort of counterpart lawyers. Yeah, I mean, sort of made whatever Freshfields, Links, A&O. They didn't have that. They would bring in banking people. They bring in whatever. We were sort of a quite an autonomous group actually. Interestingly, but it was good, and it was good fun, and it was relatively small. And back to the sort of funny point, I mean, it was a relatively small group. I'm talking 15, 20, 25 people or so, sitting within a firm that had 500 odd plus lawyers. But you felt like, you were almost a firm within a firm. It was very good fun.
A boutique firm in a larger firm.
Yeah,
So
and it was
what was the background of the senior partner that brought you with him? What was he? A litigator, or was he a corporate partner or a finance partner?
Yeah, no, he was a litigator, and again, one of those things might have been I was two offices down from him, and it was Friday afternoon, and I may have been one of the few people left in the office.
That's
But
right.
through such strange things, an entire career has crafted. So
So, because you were saying, like, being on the top table in a transaction, would you say that prior to there being a specialized, I guess, area like special sits or a restructuring, insolvency, would you say that in a transaction it was the corporate lawyers that were the top table, or was it when there's an issue, the litigators that come in and sort of assess what the damage is? How did you see that? Because you said it wasn't really the bankers, the banking team.
yeah, and I think, look, I mean, we'll speak about this. I think restructuring has developed significantly over that period of time. I think it was far more compartmentalized at the time. So, in a sense, there wasn't restructuring. There was insolvency. So, business, it's failed. You appointed, you appointed, generally speaking, from Clifford Chance's end, administrative receivers, because they're appointed by the banks. They're going to, you know, realize the assets to repay the bank. So, we were working in conjunction with, all the big accountancy firms because they were appointed in. So, it was a funeral process. It wasn't sort of any life support. So, there'll be a point of saying, okay, right, Ernst Young, KPMG, PwC, whatever, are appointed. We're going, so the litigators would do those appointment documents. There'll be then a question of, some corporate guys would then come in for those sale proceeds. And that's really how it works. There's a lot of, that's why I think it was corporate and litigation, because it was, overseeing some sort of, end process. And if you think, at the time, Maxwell was, one of the massive insolvencies, but that was, it's gone, filed for an insolvency process, and then years of litigation of the banks trying to get some of their money back. BCCI, Polypec, these are sort of massive frauds, basically, that were involved. And so, it was a litigation process of asset recovery and corporates for, the sale processes. It's moved on massively from then, but that was that initial, 92, 93, 94 sort of period.
Yeah.
And I think, look, I think it got massively more interesting. But at that point, it was still quite, compartmentalized of, is this a corporate transaction? Is this a banking transaction? Yeah, and banking was like new money. There wasn't really new money coming along there. And there'd be no free assets to sort of put new money into the business. So it was always sort of closure. But that was that sort of early period. And so, litigators and corporate made sense for those people to sit together at the outset. And then, what then happened was that sort of all that flurry of that sort of recession, which was sort of 89 to 92, which Yeah, I think a lot of that, and this sort of repeats itself to some extent, but yeah, there was a lot of, post Big Bang, lots of different financing, lots of easy money, over leveraged, and that led to, that sort of recession and as many other things. But that has sort of dried up. So by 94, those things are coming to an end. And, then it was a question about, well, how do you occupy yourself, and how do I justify my existence? And then there was another complete, this still within Clifford Chance, but another completely different change that then occurred. Which, if I can jump onto that, that was all the insurance insolvencies. But again, it was sort of failure, because it was a question of how do you deal with an insurance company failure. And yeah, those were incredibly complicated insolvencies, and it was a question of how can you deal with that, and deal with it in a shorter time frame, because the nature of insurance business meant that you may well have some liabilities that were running out, you know tens of years in the future. You wouldn't want to keep a process going for that length of time. So there was a whole period of time spent, and a whole number of people working on, a process that allowed insurance company insolvencies to be closed much, much quicker than they ever had been. So that was a very busy time from 93, 4 through to about 97 or so, and then a number of offshoots from that. But there was a lot of that sort of insurance insolvency work that happened.
And that was so that period that you're describing, the main clients were banks for Clifford Chance, and it was very much a workout that you did, and a workout in the sense like trying to recover something, so enforcing on security, and then just liquidating what is there in the most efficient way. On the
Yeah.
insurance side, was that also the pioneering of the scheme as a restructuring tool for distressed situations?
Yes, it was, and yeah, the first one, I mean, like everything, took it really was, inventing the wheel rather than reinventing the wheel, and so the first one took a very, very long time to sort of get everything right, and then there was a whole number of them that followed on from that. We were acting for the accountants who were appointed to deal with those assets. And then, a couple of other things morphed out of that, which was quite interesting. So we then also did some distressed M&A. So this sort of led to something, distressed M&A in the insurance market. And also we did um, solvent schemes. So this was sort of taking that scheme documentation, and then and I remember doing this, taking, which there's a slight argument, but I still think I did the first solvent scheme, and that was literally going home one weekend, and taking the sort of standard scheme document and sitting there with a bit of a cold towel around your head, and doing the thing that lawyers hate doing, which is taking words out rather than adding words in, thinking, okay, do I need this clause if it's solvent? And really chopping that document down, which is quite a scary thing to do. But over the course of the weekend, the bare bones, it was a bit rough. And it's a question then of, okay, I've now taken all the words out. What do I need to add some extra words in? And that took a bit longer. But we did those, and I think that was sort of about 97 or so. But it was, it is interesting. And then I think, we'll speak about one or two other things. It was, I was quite happy or foolish or whatever it might be of pushing the envelope. I was very keen about extending the art of the possible, and it didn't seem, say, maybe foolishness or whatever. It didn't seem to be that outrageous to sort of say, well, okay, why can't we use the same sort of mechanisms in a different way? That actually there are enough assets here. We can pay everyone in full. Let's use the whole process and the adjudications and agreements of claims, etc., and allowing people to shorten the life of their claim under a sort of a certain process. and people be paid in full, whatever that in full number was determined to be. So that was that was exciting stuff, to do something that was new.
And you sort of describe insolvency very much focused on liquidation, and I guess financial distress being something that obviously is a normal part of the life cycle of a business. But in a law firm, it wasn't a dedicated, specialization. And the big cases were all fraud cases.
Yeah.
So, do you think that the fact that, in the early days that you're sort of describing, it was all, undertaker's work and it was related to big frauds, that has had, a big impact on the, I guess, lasting stigma that there still is around financial distress, even though, fast forward, 30, 35 years, we have been, developing much more a rescue culture, and the tools in the toolbox. There are many more, but still, that stigma that is attached to financial distress hasn't really changed an awful lot, other than maybe in the bubble with the specialists that are dealing with this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And I mean, I think the world now, sort of the English system is very different from what it was. If you go back, 1986 Companies Act, there's a couple, there's provisions, Insolvency Act. There were, that was the new thing. So that was the Cork report on, look, there's got to be something different about insolvency here. So over a sort of a lengthy period of consultation, the Insolvency Act is written in 86. And so that led us to, receiverships, administrations, etc. But it was still very much a failure and a way of sort of closure in an efficient and effective way. A number of years beforehand, you had Chapter 11 in the US, 1978, and obviously the US system was very different. But there wasn't really rescue. There wasn't sort of rehabilitation at all, and I think a lot of that was sort of necessity being the mother of invention. And what I mean by that is that although there's significantly over levered companies through just sort of loose financing in the sort of later 80s, it was still a question the banks felt pretty comfortable that business has gone wrong. They appoint administrative receivers. They were going to get their money back in almost every case. And in fact, if no one else got any money, they didn't care. So, if a business that was supposed may have been worth 200, obviously when it becomes insolvent, things like goodwill, etc., disappear, and some quite inflated items on the balance sheet, which I've always had an issue with. Maybe then the business is worth 150, and the banks are owed 100. If the bank sold it for 101, 105, they didn't care. And I think there was a great deal of that. Banks went in, sold it. As long as they recovered, it was fine. And other creditors, and we'll come talk about what we mean by other creditors, but generally, these would be single bank or bank club group. They got their money back and they were fine. And I think, that led to a period where people were, hang on, this isn't quite right here. This isn't maximum value extraction. Banks are all fine. And that's why, it led to amendments to the Insolvency Act and limitations and obviously subsequent removal of admin receivership, generally speaking. And that moved. But I think it coincided with, you've got to have an advocate for change. And I think part of that was, where financing got more complicated again. And in the later, and it existed, but sort of again, from mid-90s on, you didn't just have bank financing. Below that, you had junior financing, which was through bonds. And the most spectacular sort of failure that involved bonds was Barings Bank. And originally those bonds were held just by standard banks, maybe just sort of, as a more junior and so therefore higher interest rate. But then those got sold out to new players, and there was US hedge funds, etc., who had a very different approach and weren't prepared to say, oh yeah, okay, bank, because it may be the bank held the senior debt and the bonds, and so okay, bonds are not going to recover. Yeah, that's life. When you suddenly got the bonds held by a different institution, that institution fundamentally it was US hedge funds. We're going, no, hang on, this isn't right. We've got to get the best value here. And there was a change in dynamic, a massive change in dynamic in the sort of later 90s, and sort of Barings was at the forefront of that. And I think that, not necessarily as a sort of a direct, I think it was a direct consequence, was a change in the law in the early 2000s to saying, look, there's got to be more of an even-handed process here. And I think through part of that, it then subsequently led to, later was it 2000 with Mandelson saying, as part of the Labour government, then no, we've got to have this idea more of rescue, and it should be a bit more like the US, etc. Which England has never become like the US, because they, fundamentally there's a difference in character, and the US is all about you go out there into the Wild West and you fail and you get up again, and that's fine. And I think England has had this sort of stigma, as you were saying, about failure. And I think that, possibly that still exists. It's not, you sort of are seen as a failure if you fail, rather than, well, you tried very hard and you're going to fail a few times and get up and carry on. But I think that was, there was quite a shift, I think, when you were speaking not of homogenous, banking group that's owed senior debt, but you had different institutions that held junior debt. That changed all of the dynamic of how a restructuring happened. And I think a lot of that, late 90s, and then junk bond financing for dot-coms, etc., around 2000 led to quite a different set of issues to deal with. You weren't talking about bricks and mortar and readily realizable assets that you could go and see and take an inventory of, and you owed a one or a limited number of banks. It was then quite different, and I think restructuring became fundamentally very different around at the end of the sort of late 90s, early 2000s.
And so bank financing was sort of the primary source of financing earlier on. Then I guess capital markets, come online. There are more sources of financing, and therefore, more, I guess, lenders. It's not just banks, but other institutions, and that changes the dynamics. But Barings again, also a fraud involved. What was it within the law firm, Clifford Chance, Magic Circle? How was that new department viewed? Did it have a reputation, good or bad? Clifford Chance wasn't known for being a restructuring firm, was it?
No, I think at the outset, I mean, I guess to some extent, Clifford Chance was sort of slightly new kids on the block. Possibly, less traditional, less that sort of traditional city institution. I guess restructuring is a bit of at the rough end of the rough end of the law. You're not doing some nice financing or a nice corporate deal. I always said that you have to buy your own champagne because no one's going to buy you a glass. You're not doing a financing deal and everyone says this is going to be wonderful. You haven't just completed an M&A deal where everyone says everything's wonderful and we're going to earn lots of money. It's like, oh, we've got to have these people in the in the room, and we don't like them, and we don't like anything they say. But I think we were seen as a necessary. I think certainly in the 90s, we were seen as a necessary evil. And we cleaned things up and we got things done. I think when things moved and I moved from Clifford Chance to Cadwalader, which opened an office in September '97. So again, I sort of first person with a few others in the door on September. And the first job we had was to continue acting for the bondholders in Bearings, and then that sort of steamrolled into acting for a lot of bond restructurings, and you know just just the nature of it is that those junior creditors, bondholders, they're all US, took a contrary position to English and European banks, and we we were seen as just like the worst thing possible, and I think we're probably almost universally hated in the city for representing these people who were changing the dynamic. And it was yeah, it was an interest it was an interesting period of time, and it certainly helps the camaraderie when you feel that you're a small group in a very small firm. And at that point, I think day one in London, Cadwalader had, I don't know, about 8 people or something. So going from a 500 lawyer, whatever it was, even bigger than that at the time, to going across the road and you've got half a dozen people, you very much felt that you had to put out the barricades and protect yourself. But you learn stuff, and it was, again, now I've probably forgotten all the scars. It was good fun. It was exciting, but we certainly didn't make any friends at the time.
So it was a little bit of a startup. Yeah, I think you're describing it very well. There were changes afoot, not only on the bank side. They're being sort of the primary players in insolvency for workouts. All of a sudden, there are other institutions that you come across, primarily out of the States, where I guess distressed investing, hedge funds, distressed investors was something that had already developed a little bit more than it was, the case in the UK, in London, and in Europe. I started practice in 1995, and I came to the to London in 2000. So it's around the time that you're sort of describing, and obviously, when I really fully sort of started here, which was when my Dutch firm decided not to merge with Linklaters and stay independent. It was like Linklaters Alliance. That was my ticket to come here. Then I sort of decided not to go back to the Netherlands but stay in London. You were very much one of the people in that distressed space in a US firm, representing new players, bondholders. And when I sort of moved from my Dutch firm to Aiken Gump at that point in time, I went to New York first in order to be introduced to that practice, the practice that you actually represent bondholders. Bondholders are completely, different breed than, the normal sort of players that we've seen in Europe. And it was, enormously eye-opening for me as well. At the same time, Blackberries came in, everything went faster. There's a lot of changes all of a sudden in a very short space of time, especially in our field. So, maybe tell me a little bit about, being the pioneer of leaving, I guess, a Magic Circle firm. Why would you leave a Magic Circle firm to, go for a startup situation in one of those cowboy firms from the States that is landed in London? And obviously, how will they ever compete with, I guess, the traditional Magic Circle firms of one, you're in one of those. What sort of was the incentive to be a pioneer in that way?
Uh I think that maybe it's a reflection, more on myself. But I had, I'd been at Clifford Chance then 7 years. I'd done a lot of amazing stuff, worked with a lot of incredibly good people, done exciting work. And the Cadwalader thing came along. I'd never heard of them as a firm, to be honest.
No.
But you know, the bearings thing was sort of changing, and the sort of fact that um, I guess there was a sort of thought. I wasn't sure. Clifford Chance then got a pretty sizable firm, and yeah, maybe restructuring was quietening down to some extent. And I began to look at my own career progression, and it didn't look particularly clear. It may well have worked. I mean, who knows? We don't live parallel lives. So, if I'd
No.
stayed, who knows what would have happened? And maybe it had all been, fine. Cadwell was a massive leap into the unknown. But I saw opportunity there. Uh, Maybe I saw the opportunity and I didn't properly assess the downside. And it was a pretty fraught place for a couple of years or so.
And
But
sometimes that is exactly what it is, Lyndon, right? The fact that
yeah, I
you're
mean,
not that mature and, you maybe not see the downside, which is why you have, the guts and the balls to actually make the step, because you don't know that there is maybe a lot of risk
yeah, I mean,
attached to it,
I
and therefore you
think
have confidence.
I think sort of looking backwards, through some strange myopic spectacles, I sort of justified it by things didn't really go wrong, so that was a good thing. And I think I possibly overplayed what I perceived to be uncertainty about my career path within Clifford Chance. So I made the move for maybe not particularly well thought out reasons, but and it was a massive challenge. But it's interesting that and I think it required, quite a different mindset and personality to go from, incredible comfort of, this huge firm that had all these precedents and whatever, to going somewhere that literally we had absolutely nothing. I mean, truly nothing. And I say it's sort of amusing now, but at the time, yeah, that's all pretty wild stuff. But as they say, what doesn't kill you, and I think it was character
Makes
building.
you only stronger. Yeah, but
Yeah, and then
you've gathered. Yeah,
how the sort of the thing. I mean, I again, maybe by luck or sticking my hand up when no one else was foolish enough to do so. I mean, during that time, I was then asked by a US partner to get involved in this big restructuring in Southeast Asia, and I'd worked in Southeast Asia briefly before, so I said yes. And the big change was that was acting for the debtor, acting for the company. And over what was it then? Sort of close to 10 years, I'd never done that. I'd acted for banks, I'd acted for office holders, I'd acted for bond holders. So it was all new again. And it was a lengthy restructuring that took 18 months or so plus. Um, and I just found it massively more fulfilling. Just at a personal level, I just thought, I like this. And because I felt it was positive, it was a point of saying, how do I help this business? How can I help this business? And I guess that's sort of the first bit of recovery to some extent. How can we do something here? Rather than just as a bank, I want my money back, which is a perfectly valid point. Or for bondholders, which was much more of um, how can I cause the maximum level of disruption that I can be paid some money to go away? Because that was, and look, I've massively simplified, and that wasn't always the case, but there was elements of that which. When you're continually doing that, and we used to say, you used to call it rock throwing. We used to just be the rock throwers. And at the beginning, that's quite exciting to throw rocks, but then after a period of time, it's like, okay, that gets slightly tedious. Just from a professional point of view, but acting on the data side, well, I thought, well, actually, I like this. This is interesting stuff, and it's much more positive as I perceived it, and that then led me. And I'd spent a lot of time in Asia and very little time in London. So it's quite dislocated from the London office at that point. So when that job finished, I thought, well, actually, I don't want to continue to do this rock throwing. Actually, working on the debtor side would be a good thing, and that led to going to Kirkland Ellis. So which is obviously the massive debtor side practice. So CADS was a walkthrough in a sense. I mean, quite a long 5 odd year walkthrough, but it was a walkthrough that led me to a very, very different part of my career.
And maybe sort of pause there for a second. So you said that one of your seats was at Clifford Chance going to Singapore, and then actually that experience being outside of London, the UK, and experiencing Asian culture set you up nicely for this role that you then got in Cadwalader, doing a debtor engagement. What how was that experience, and how important is it, you believe, to actually be in another culture, in another jurisdiction? Asia, obviously, Singapore, maybe somebody else said, Singapore is like, Asia for beginners. It's not like, really, really, hardcore, but it is obviously very different. What's sort of your experience there, and how did it then help you in this case that you did?
I think yeah, Asia for beginners is probably a very good phrase. I think I'd fully agree with that. I'm probably now in Africa for beginners as well, being in South Africa. But um, yeah, I think, I mean, look, it's Singapore is Asia for beginners, but there is, it's a massively different culture shift compared to the UK or Europe, and it is, it's absolutely essential to be sensitive to that. You need to understand, the different dynamics that exist, and the second time around, I mean, actually, each time, it wasn't only Singapore, but significantly Indonesia, which is not so much a Southeast Asia for beginners,
No.
and this was coming soon after all of the Asian currency crises, etc. So, yeah, Jakarta was quite an eye-opening place for lots of reasons. But yeah, you have to very much be sensitive to that, and I think to some degree there was a not necessarily acceptance of you, but again, you were the necessary evil. That I think they would have much rather have done things entirely locally, but realizing that the creditors they had, that it needed, you know, other than local people, other than local Singapore and Indonesian people. So yeah, I mean, I think wherever you go, wherever it is, you can't be the bull in the china shop. That just never works. The ball will knock things over, and I think as restructuring, sometimes you've got to break things, but if you need to try and make things work, and you've got to try and build a consensus. I mean, it's a bit of a trite phrase, but you do need to try and build that consensus, and just bashing someone's head against the wall might be sort of pleasurable for a few minutes, but it never achieves anything. Sometimes you've got to knock a few ideas in, but at the end of the day, you can't coerce someone into a deal. They've got to believe it for themselves. Maybe they need a reality check, but I think understanding the cultures and understanding what's important, and Asia just has some quite different dynamics from the UK.
Were you like, prepared for that change, or was it very much, you find out along the way, trial and error as to how it works and what doesn't work?
I think there was a bit of both. I mean, although it'd been a number of years before I'd been, since I'd been in Asia, I sort of understood how some of those things worked, and I think it was. yeah, second time round, yeah, the experience, yeah, amplified, particularly when, yeah, you look at a bunch of stuff happening in Indonesia. And I think, what was also very relevant, which actually maybe again has put me in a good position for, when we talk about my being here in South Africa, is that, yeah, politics played a massive part in Indonesia. So, oddly, I found very oddly that you'd sit there at the beginning of meetings that, we had every single week and would go on for a week. Um, there'd be a discussion about the political situation, which of course I could make no comment to whatsoever. But yeah, because politics was all tied up in, when you're dealing with banks and half those banks are state owned and or other influential, politically connected people, etc. That was a factor in, everything going into the melting pot. The politics, what was acceptable, government position was all relevant. Well, in the UK, that's almost never relevant unless it's a certain type of institution. So
Like
that was
Thames
quite
Water these days.
yeah. But other than that, the government's not going to care about a particular business or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but that was super relevant there. And as we'll come on to, it's very relevant here as well.
And yeah, exactly. So what was it that you were able to achieve in your debtor, engagement that you had at Cadwalader? That was obviously, quite different from, your experience at Clifford Chance, where, yeah, you were approaching the situation from a different angle. Now you were, on the debtor side. You were able to rescue the business or sort of, isolate certain pieces and, liquidate those, but continue others? Or, what was sort of the end result that made you think actually, liquidation is not the only solution. Parts can actually be rescued.
I think it may have happened anyway, in terms of whatever side you were sitting on, whether it was junior debt, senior debt, company side, regulators even. That restructuring's changed anyway, but at the time for me, it was that, from the company side, what you needed to do was control the situation. Yeah, whether and I always said you need to be driving the bus, and if you're not driving the bus, someone else will drive that. But the company should be driving the bus for the company. Anyone else driving the bus is going to drive it for themselves. And if you're a senior creditor, you're going to say the outcome has to be what best suits me as a senior creditor. That's not necessarily the best answer as a whole. I think only the company, as long as it's not delusional, will deliver the best result as a whole. And so it was that whole idea of saying, okay, I'm sort of the ringmaster, if you like, as a sort of a different analogy. Um, Understanding what everyone wanted and then trying to get to some level of consensus that worked. And that was quite a different role, rather than just saying, these are my contractual rights, and that's what I'm going after, hell for leather. It was much more of, okay, I hear what you're saying. Okay, look, you've got some rights, you haven't got some rights, you've got leverage, you haven't got leverage. Yeah, we need to be doing this, you've got to give something up. So it was much more that negotiating, I guess, almost for the first time, that, properly negotiating in a positive way.
And how does English law feature into all of this? Is it, the bank documents are still English law and that's where it is, but you're outside of the UK, obviously negotiating a cross-border situation, being an English solicitor.
Yeah, I mean, look, for good or for bad, English law is pretty widespread. So certainly, in numbers of parts of Southeast Asia, it's English law, and either directly English law in contractual documents, or something very similar in terms of statute. It's based on old, 1948 Companies Act stuff. So you may not be entirely familiar with process and procedure, but in terms of the substance, and just having more experience of it. The fact that could come along and say, I've done 10, 15, 20 of these things. That's enormously helpful because, again, back for sort of junior people, every negotiation would be 1, 10, 2, 9, 3, 8. Yeah. And you go, look, there's no point in that. We know where it goes. So let's start negotiating 4 till 6 and we'll chop out all those others. We know where we're going. We'll just get rid of that. Let's be much more efficient of this stuff. And having had got the t-shirts, as they say, on many of these things, there's not that much necessarily new, or you can adapt to what you've got. I think that just speeds up the process. And in a restructuring context, time is incredibly important because it wastes money, and there's little
Yeah.
of that to be wasted.
Yeah. So Cadwalader was very much startup situation. I
Yeah.
guess, similarly, when you had the opportunity to move to Kirkland and Ellis in London for restructuring, that was equally a startup situation. What was, sort of your lessons learned from Cadwalader's experience that you were able to carry, over to Kirkland and Ellis? And just, your experience dealing with a startup situation, having been, previously just in a very established environment. What were sort of, what did you learn from that? And how has it you further developed, as a special sits lawyer?
Yeah. Well, clearly, I never learned from my previous experiences because, So, I mean, people probably find this quite remarkable now. But so 2002, moving to Kirkland, so just post 9/11, and obviously sort of decimating, the financial world for a number of months. It just went into sort of hibernation. Um, I joined Kirkland, I think, as the 21st, 22nd, 23rd lawyer, something like that. I mean, what have they got now? Probably about 500 or something crazy. I was
Yeah.
the second. I was the second English lawyer in the office. We had one floor in the Gherkin. But I wasn't disturbed by any of that because 5 odd years early I'd literally walked across the road into Cadwalader where I was one of a dozen people, and I'm not sure we had any telephones or anything at that point in time. At least walking into Kirkland, it was a proper office. It'd been there for a number of years. Wasn't on the radar in terms of English law at all. It was very much servicing the US. But it was a proper office and had this enormous machine and business in the US. And so to some extent, all that sort of, hey, I'm on my own, and it was on my own, and then with one other person, and then it sort of it went on from there. But going into somewhere going, I'm on my own, that was not a worry to me at all. I knew I initially would be working significantly with the US, which made it a soft landing in terms of getting things going. And so having been in a startup, it meant that that wasn't a problem. And what you do, and what I mean by that is when you're in a big institution, you can sort of sit at your desk and sort of work happens. When you're in a startup or something you've got to go and pound the streets. You've got to go and make it happen. And it's interesting that those that have gone through that experience, and someone who worked with me, who you are well known at a boutique litigation firm, let's call it that,
Yeah.
has equally said the same things about, you've got to go out there and you've got to pound the streets and you have to make it happen. And again, that's not for everyone. It's not for everyone to, pick up the phone or, send the email and send it round and be a businessman and be very proactive. That's not really what many lawyers are. I think it's what restructuring lawyers, or many of them, are, because it's the nature of what we do. But So a lot of that, again, it's okay. I'm starting from fresh, and I'm on my own. I've got to make this work, and I was the person leading the group, leading the charge. But it was quite different having sort of that enormous US presence that was there.
And was Lyndon, because one of my experience, well, my experiences have been with U.S. firms that there is the promise of the U.S. actually providing you with things to start working on, but that promise is not always fulfilled, and a lot of the, I guess, London offices, are very much still, eat what you kill there, and the U.S. With the Chapter 11 and the completely different system, isn't necessarily feeding London. So how was that for you when you started? Was there, a matter, or a couple of matters that sort of got you started, and sort of, it was built from there, or was it something else that you've generated yourself that was sort of the kickstart of everything that follows from there?
It was a mix, to be honest. There was one or two things came from the US, but I'll come back to that. There was one or two things on the corporate side in the London office that was doing some European deals that had some stress in them. And so on both of those, it was a question of saying, what can I do to help? Where can I add value? And that was very much, sort of phrase that if you've got a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail. So it's a bit like, a restructuring lawyer sees the bad, sees wrong. So I was able on the things in London to say, look, I think I can add something here. I can do something here. I can help. I can participate. Yeah, and that was first of all quite low key, and then you sort of build up some reputation. People, trust your advice, etc. So that started sort of help on the London front. It's slightly different on the US side. Was obviously there was a huge restructuring department in Kirkland, and they obviously knew exactly what they were doing on the US side. But if there was anything that was, as we call it, ROW, rest of the world, it was, they sort of ignored it. Now, often, ROW wasn't particularly significant for a US Chapter 11. Um, but I said, well, I can do that stuff. There's stuff I can do here. Look, you don't know that stuff. I do. And then not
And it
only
doesn't necessarily need to be English, right? The rest of the
no,
world, I
well,
can
and
do
it
everything else. Yeah.
it was ROW. So, it's like, okay, look, I understand the English stuff, but you also, and I mean, much more so through Kirkland. But I'd got some experience. I had a network of people that I could say, okay, look, I can phone up some Portuguese lawyers, I can phone up some Spanish lawyers, I can phone up German lawyers, and we can do all of your, certainly Western Europe and probably some Asian stuff, because I'd been there. And you just grow out that network. And so, it was again a question of sort of making the most of what was there. Because what the US didn't want is you taking a bit of their pie. Yeah. So what you said is, I'll make the pie bigger. And that was the thing of trying to, and that doesn't sound like a lawyer trying to invent work. It wasn't necessarily, or maybe it was inventing some work, but it's inventing work for the benefit of, look, we can get a better outcome here. So, there was a number of matters where I dealt with the ROW on Chapter 11 matters. But then, there was a number of private equity things that weren't necessarily going particularly well in London, based around Europe, and so I jumped into those. I was very happy to, I did telecos in Germany and Portugal, and then later did other things all over the place, because I was quite happy to do that. Again, I didn't feel constrained that I've got my comfort zone here in England, and I'm terrified of everywhere else. It'd be, well, look, I'll stumble along and get some help on the way from people that do know the detail. So I'll try and take a bigger picture, more holistic, 30,000 foot view, and get all the right detail at the ground level.
And you obviously were, probably lucky that you had in the States, somebody like Jamie Sprayregen, who,
Mhm.
force of nature, in many respects, but also had a very, cross-border mindset and a
Yeah.
commercial approach, and probably, a kind of person that you could, deal with, and provided support, because ultimately you need to have the support and somebody in the States that sort of, allows you to build stuff outside of the States. Was that, as I, from the outside thought was that indeed very helpful?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, Jamie was, as you say, a force of nature. We got on, at a personal level, just incredibly well. And I don't think we had any disagreements about anything. Possibly because of one of Jamie's phrases, which was saying, "You're right, but also I'm right," when we'd maybe have diametrically different views, which I never understood how I could be right and he could be right on completely opposite opinions. But that was and is his nature, and yeah, we'd have some robust conversations. But he was incredibly supportive, and when I felt it was important, I mean, Kirkland were deciding to go into Germany, and I felt it important to expand the restructuring group to Germany as well, because there was a lot of restructuring going on. And whenever I contacted any German lawyer, it seemed to be that whatever question I asked, the answer was always no. And I just thought, well, this can't be right, or maybe it is right. But I thought, there's an opportunity, there's a business opportunity here to find a German lawyer that might say yes to maybe some mad ideas. Yeah, and I accept maybe some of my ideas were pushing the envelope, but I needed some people to say, okay, look, we're not going to say no, but it may be a challenge, and we might see if we can get to at least half yes. And so, but again, there, Jamie was incredibly supportive of understanding that, yep, look, we're only just starting off in his office, but you want two partners, coming into that as well. And it proved to be a great thing. So, yeah, he was incredibly supportive.
And do you think, if you compare maybe Cadwalader with Kirkland, that the absence of a Jamie Sprayregen person in Cadwalader is also, quite a difference between the two firms, especially in that area of restructuring, where if you're in a US firm, headquarters are there, you need to have a sponsor, and a meaningful sponsor, in order to, grow the practice outside of the US?
Um, yeah, I mean, look, CAD had some very good people. Yeah, no question. They had some very good people, and they were supportive. Certainly, very supportive at sort of the restructuring group level. I think the nature of the work was different. That there wasn't that obvious. You know, they didn't do those big corporate chapter 11s that, I was fortunate enough that some of those had some, ROW businesses that I could sort of jump onto. But yeah, they were supportive. But I think, the drive of the firm was sort of different. But they were very supportive of restructuring.
Yeah. Okay. Um, Look, special sits is something that, has developed as its own practice. I think you've sort of described it, quite well in, your journey. You've seen the signpost and developed the practice and be part of that practice. Um, it is, law as such is not like necessarily a 9 to 5 practice. Certain departments are a lot more predictable than others. Um, um, Special sits, is probably known for, being unpredictable, and when it's on, it's on. And it could be feast or famine, as we all know. Um, how has that sort of, influenced, your life? Because your professional life actually becomes, almost entirely your whole life, right? And, trying to balance all that is not always easy. We've, come from, I guess, Magic Circle now to sort of Kirkland and Ellis. A lot has happened. How, how was that for you, and what are sort of lessons learned there for people that are in the weeds, that try to sort of balance everything?
Yeah, look, that's very difficult. I think it's far more difficult for people now. So the first point I'd make is that uh, early 90s, we didn't have the technology, right? So when you left the office, you sort of left the office. Someone could phone you up at home, but that wasn't really going to happen particularly often, and you may not be home. So there it was. But that meant that work was sort of relatively sensible, and I think maybe again I didn't seem to suffer from having to do lots of all nights or weekends or whatever. And then it was a slow ramp up, I guess what I'm trying to say. So if you suddenly go in and you've got to do 2,500 hours or something, you've come from university, that's going to be a major shock. But then people get paid incredibly well now, so I'm not quite sure you can complain anyway, is my dinosaur view of things. But when you start off and you're maybe doing 1,500, 1,600 or something, and then it's now like 1,800 or it's 2,000, it's a slow thing, like they say of boiling frogs or whatever. It's sort of 1 degree increases in temperature. You don't notice it until you're dead. But I think that was maybe just at the time it just built up. It certainly is much harder, I think, now, and it's sort of expected that higher level, and the fact that you are definitely 24/7 available. And I think I think I just accepted it. And it wasn't necessarily that I was working 24/7, but I was definitely available 24/7. And actually, funnily, having a conversation with my eldest daughter a few months ago, we was just chatting generally, and she just said to me, because we always went on holiday. I'd never cancelled a holiday ever, but she said to me, "You were always on the phone. You're always on the phone. We rented a house somewhere, you'd be walking, pacing around the garden, with your earphones in, talking like hours on some conference call, or you'd be sitting with your feet in the swimming pool on a conference call, or we go down to the beach, you'd be on a conference call." And I thought, oh, yeah, I do sort of vaguely remember that. And I said, well, the choices really were not going on holiday, or you went on holiday when I was one ear, one eye, not there. Yeah, that not perfect, right? Not perfect. Not the worst in the world, not the best in the world. But I can see a lot of people, and particularly maybe sort of what we find acceptable today is different from what we found acceptable 20 years ago or something. But there was that. It did become all consuming to a large extent. I always say I didn't work crazily hard, but actually, I probably massively under-recorded, because you were always available, and maybe half time, even when you were doing something else, you were thinking about it. You were thinking about what the solution might be. So, even if you was commuting for an hour, then you got to the office and suddenly you had this, great idea, and you sort of wrote it all down in a memo. But you'd forgot about the hour you were thinking about it whilst you're standing on the train. So that in itself, I think, it did take a lot of time up, and it just, I found, and so, maybe everyone that I worked with, we all did the same. So you didn't feel, oh, this person's only doing half the amount I am. It was sort of what everyone was doing. But I certainly remember a whole number of things where, on one particular matter, because I was doing literally ROW, I'd start up phone calls at 5 o'clock in the morning in Australia and New Zealand, whatever, and then do a number of those, get to sort of Southeast Asia, then jump on the train, go to work, do that, and then get home and start doing Uruguay and Argentina and Chile, whatever, in the evening. And you sort of think that was pretty mad, wasn't it? But it worked. But I wasn't going to sit in the office from 5 o'clock in the morning till midnight, but I was happy to do 3 or 4 hours each end of the day at home. But and that's sort of how it worked. But yeah, not perfect, but yeah, it didn't kill me again. So
Yeah. Look, resonates with me a lot. I think 2000, 2001, 2002, that's when the technology, I guess, really kicked in with the Blackberries. I was absolutely stunned when I, went to the States with Aiken, and I saw people, being able to send emails from the back of the car from a Blackberry. I'd not seen that before. I was like, whoa, what is going on here? And yeah, obviously, once that is possible, then it becomes 24/7. I also, not too long ago saw some early, videos that my wife took from us and the kids on holidays when they were little. And as you say, I was always there too. But, I always see myself on the phone as well, right? I'm like, for crying out loud, that was just, that's me all the time. And I guess, that's how the kids remember it. And I'm also very much with you. If you're in an environment where everybody does that, then, there's nothing wrong with it. I
yeah. I mean,
actually did see
I'm not
something.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, look, the technology is great stuff. There's always pros and cons of all of it. And I always joke with people and saying when I started, it was letters. And so you'd respond to a letter within a week, and then it was a fax, and that'd be within a day. And then you had this big box on your desk, which someone told me was a computer. And then it's like, a shorter period, and then
We're
the
old.
BlackBerry. Yeah, and but also, and no, all of that's good. But I mean, I think that, and I'm showing my age particularly, but when I started, and certainly with sort of documents, your secretary typed that stuff up, and so we had these deliberate breaks, like every 8 pages, so that only 8 pages would have to be retyped. But because you knew you get the wrath of your your secretary to ask her to make amendments, and that went across the board. Every firm was the same, so everyone was terrified of their secretaries, really. Um, you made as few changes as possible, or you made them in sort of substantive chunks, and so documents didn't go through ridiculous numbers of versions. And then when you could change them in like a nanosecond, it's like you got to version 97 or whatever. And you go, I don't think that's efficient. I think there's less thinking sometimes goes on because, if you're told here's a document and you can only change it once, you're going to really, really think and get that right. When you think, oh, I can change it 50 times, it's like, oh, yeah, I've forgotten that. Well, I'll do it tomorrow. Oh, there's another thing. Oh, I forgot that as well. So to some extent, I think we're not brilliantly efficient because the technology allows us to be inefficient. And I wonder whether some of our hours is spent because we're doing version 96 rather than thinking much harder at version 1 or 2.
Yeah. Well, and the expectation is indeed, since you're 24/7 available. As soon as something comes in, you need to respond. So there's this pressure to respond,
Yeah.
and sometimes time cures a lot of things, right? If you don't respond for whatever reason, because you're on a plane or whatever, and you come back and you see what happens, actually things have resolved themselves while
Yeah.
you're away, and and it goes to the point that you're making. Do you think that? Again, you're describing, the change from Magic Circle to Cadwalader to Kirkland to U.S. firms, that also the U.S. mentality towards law and law firms and practice, was contaminating, I guess, how things had to be done in London as well. And then with the clients coming over, the U.S. hedge funds as opposed to the traditional, banks with the relationship view. But then we have the funds coming in a distressed market, getting, able to buy at a discount, therefore having a different, business proposition as to what success is going to mean for them, and the attitude, the speed at which they're operating, the sophistication, all of that, all of a sudden, finds its way into London in our practice, and obviously we need to, catch up and run along. And it changes how you do your business.
Absolutely, and I think sort of the US firms in London. I mean, there were a number that had effectively just a post box for a number of years. And I think it was Gotchery that were the first to sort of get going in a substantive way, which is probably about 95, 5, 6, something like that. But then even for still a lengthy-ish period of time. I think the firms were still servicing their US clients rather than saying, yeah, we want a substantial standalone English practice. And that probably took 15 years or so, really, probably to sort of 2010 plus, or even beyond that, really, probably more like 2015. So that's quite a long gestation period, if you like. But I do think, now there's obviously a number of firms that have got very, very substantive English law qualified practices in London in those US firms. But I do think they are operated along US lines rather than operated along sort of traditional English lines. So there's that, and the nature of who the clients are. I mean, the fact that the function and role of traditional banks and in English banks is incredibly diminished. And so much finance happening through funds and private credit, etc. I think the US firms were just better placed to grab hold of all of that, which undoubtedly they have. And I think fundamentally that a US client, they're familiar with the service they receive from the US, and they expect that wherever they are around the world. And I do think there's a significant number now have picked that up and run with it, and have done incredibly well to see that opportunity. And you look at the revenues and statistics now. I think both Kirkland and Latham are inside as London offices, as a standalone London office, not as the globally. But those two are in the top 7 or 8 or something of all firms operating in the UK. And I think if you'd said 15 years ago, Kirkland Latham's as 2 will be comparable or bigger revenue than a Linklaters or a Clifford Chance, I mean, no one would have thought that. And that's a severe. It's a massive, massive change that's happened. And look, I think you have to go with the flow. You have to be flexible, and I think there's been a struggle for not necessarily Magic Circle, but for sort of the firms, the more mid-tier things. I think they've massively struggled because I think they have to service very different clients. They're not going to be in that space, and maybe they don't want to be, because clearly, it's pretty hardcore of working in one of those firms. But I think that's why they're paid what they are.
So in Cadwalader, you sort of, got a taste of distressed investors, hedge funds, that side of, I guess, the special sit space. But you were saying in Kirkland, you were also introduced to private equity, and they're a little bit, a different part of the special sit space. They're the debtor side, sponsors, portfolio companies that need assistance. And then, will they allow us, people in that space early enough to sort of, help out, yes or no, our, colleagues, corporate colleagues in particular, willing to bring you in early enough so that you can do something? Or is there still, even within a law firm, the sort of hesitation to bring in the the special seats guys because it sends out the wrong message, because there still is the stigma. What's your experience with that? Was that actually in Kirkland not the case? And were you brought in early, and therefore debtor engagements could be set up in a way that rescue is possible because you were early enough introduced to the situation?
I think, look, this is the the comment that all restructuring lawyers will make. We are never brought in early enough. We are never brought in early enough. I don't think I have ever been able to say in I wouldn't know how many matters I've done, "Oh, thank you, I've come in on day one." It's usually day one before death. And we've all
Yeah.
known, there are, and I've given presentations and I've shown them this sort of curve of saying, here are all your options day one, and they diminish over time. It never happens, and it never happens for, look, in a sense, lots of good reasons. People are, other than restructuring lawyers, people are generally optimistic, not pessimistic. It's their livelihood, their business, their job, whatever. They don't want to lose it, so they hang on far longer than they should. The bank may believe that it's going to turn around, and so they'll give some levels of forbearances, or what we saw post 2008, that the banks didn't really have anything out, and anywhere else to go, so they had to hang in there because there wasn't going to be a buyer for some distressed situation. So for lots of reasons, people just hope for the best, even if the restructuring lawyer will say that's not happening. And we will be disbelieved, and we're not the people invited to the room. As I say, we have to buy our own drinks. And to some extent, I mean, I found. I mean, look, no one likes. In a sense, it's like admitting you got something wrong. So a bank doesn't want to do that because they don't want to admit, they lent to a bad borrower. So they'll hope that look, maybe next quarter be fine, and they give some level of forbearance, or some covenant reset or something, because that's sort of the easier way to do, and you don't put it in the bad debt book. A company sits there, and it's the owners or whatever, directors, and they've got a vested interest, obviously, at lots of levels, not to give up, not to throw the keys across the table. And to some extent, I think PE is sort of a nuance on that, because I always say, there's sort of an excuse. And I make a silly comment here, but if you make widgets, you say, "I make widgets, I can't add up." Now, that's probably not a good comment to make if you're the CFO, but you can basically say, "I don't add up. I make widgets." Okay, so that's your excuse. If you're private equity, you're supposed to add up. You're not making the widget, someone else is doing. You are the guy that says, this is a good investment. This is a good investment. We're going to leverage this thing, blah, blah, blah. Then it goes wrong. You can't turn around and go, I don't add up. I make widgets. You are the guy that's supposed to add up. So I think it's even more difficult for PE to, accept that the portfolio company's gone wrong. That was sort of my experience of it. Look, they are going to be very, very rational about stuff, but admitting that something's gone wrong, particularly if it's an early part of an investment cycle, that's difficult.
Understood. So what do you think is then the big difference between private equity and hedge funds? Because people that are not in the space think, well, funds are funds, private equity and hedge funds, same thing, but they're really not, right?
No, and I think it's sort of which side you're looking at things. I mean, you made the point earlier about you know distressed, discounted purchases, etc. And look, and I think a lot of people, certainly in the early days, people really disliked sort of the funds coming in. But I've always said, look, going back to as I call myself a sort of necessary evil, I go, and I've tried to do it here. I must admit, with actually no no success whatsoever, of saying, look, these funds provide liquidity. You don't want to be involved. You don't want to spend a very long time dealing with this restructuring. You're a bank that wants to go and lend new money. You go off, sell at whatever rate is appropriate. You're gone. You spend your new money. Off you go. These guys now have got a very different dynamic. They've bought in a 20, 50, 80, whatever it might be. That's a different dynamic to see how this thing is done. Some of those will be, some of those are short term, some of those are longer. Then on the other side, you got PE saying, look, this is all, this is an equity investment. Yes, I'm leveraging this thing up, but I see this because the basic position of there's a lot of cost cutting that can be done here, improvements, efficiencies, whatever. I think there's a whole bunch that sort of sit between the two of those that are the pure debt holders, and that's what they're doing. Those are sort of the pure equity holders. But then I think there's a number that say, no, actually, look, I'm quite happy to do both here because, and again, it's another tool in your box, if you like, that someone says, okay, look, I understand. Because if you say to certain banks, you need to do it, you've got to do a debt for equity swap here. They say we can't do that, and there are certain funds that cannot do that. So they go. So if you're stuck with those institutions, well, that whole gamut of what you want to be able to do isn't available. So you need to bring the guys in, and I've tried to do that, going, okay, look, you can't do that, but I know some people over here that the day, or the split second that there's that debt for equity swap, they will take that equity from you. They'll do that. So that they're providing some flexibility in this process. So, I think you just got to look at there's those three. You got the pure equity ownership, you've got the pure debt, whether that's short or longer term, and those that will play both. And we'll be looking at all of this just very, very economically rationally.
Yeah, yeah. So you were how long at Kirkland? Because you started at 2002 till 2009.
Yeah,
A
and
lot
and
happened.
10. Yeah.
Yeah, and 10. Yeah. So a lot happened. That practice really, kickstart, got off the ground, and you had some, some significant engagements. Is there
Uh-huh.
anything, sort of from that time, an engagement that springs to mind that you thought was just, significant for you?
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting. I did. I don't know if you can see it. I jotted down. There we go. You won't see the detail. In preparation for this, I jotted down some sort of thoughts. Quite scarily, I jotted down 35 years of practice on one piece of paper, which
Well,
is quite bad.
that's very concise.
Which is interesting as sort of just puts it into some perspective. I can put my entire working life onto one page. But the one did I did note, and I think was very, very significant to the firm, to everyone working on it, was Collins and Aikman, where that was a big US restructuring, but had a very, very significant operations across most of Western Europe. And there's a lot of interaction. That was probably about 2005, 6. There's a lot of interaction between the US, my US colleagues and myself, running it from this side. Lots of issues thrown up of the US wanting any spare cash coming from Europe back into the US to get a big, as big a pot of money as possible in the US. Us trying to stop that. So you had some real conflict between the European operations and the US operations. And then the biggest thing we did was, I guess this was sort of a lot of experience, and back to my my German lawyer issue of the answer's always no. I thought, well, hang on. We had I think it was 24 different companies in 10 different countries.
And
And
this was automotive, right?
it was automotive,
Collins
yes,
and
tier
yep.
two automotive, yeah. So yeah, they made gearboxes and acoustics and steering wheels and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And we thought, okay, how do we, we've got this big US process on one side. How on earth are we trying to deal with, England, Spain, Sweden, France, Czech Republic? And it's like, okay, this is like Italy. And then somehow we just thought, and it's a very, very early days about Comey shifting. And so again, in terms of racing in where angels would fear to tread, I thought, okay, we can do this. We can make every single one of those companies subject to jurisdiction of the English courts. So we organized the facts so that we had sufficient nexus with the English courts for the English courts to be able to grant administration orders over every single one of those companies. And that may not have been the very, very first Comey shift, but it was certainly second at latest, but it was certainly the most significant size and scope of shifting all those companies to the UK, and just really pushing the envelope there and doing far more than had been done before. And so I think that was actually a very exciting thing to do. That is really pushing that envelope out there.
And
Some would say
that went, sorry, and that would hand it, so the Comey shift on the one hand, and then also going to court and asking for permission to have more of, or less, a synthetic secondary proceeding. You're not opening the secondary proceeding, but you basically, allow the priorities that would be, followed in that secondary proceeding
yeah,
to apply
that,
in the English administration, which was, absolutely completely novel, and a first step in cross-border insolvency that was very significant.
yeah, and that's, we had to sort of try and square so many different circles. And as you say, that was one of the key ones. We were concerned that if the priorities went in accordance with English administration, that we were then going to get challenges from local creditors, in whatever jurisdiction. So we had to turn around and say, no, although this is an English procedure, you will be paid in accordance with local priorities. And then persuade the English judge to, make this really strange order that permitted that. So it was good. That was I think one of the best things that we did.
Yeah, and put it in context, that was 2005, 2006. So that was at a time where obviously the UK was still part of the EU insolvency
Yeah.
regulation on the one hand, but on the other hand, we didn't have the cross-border insolvency regulations 2006 yet. The
No.
adoption of the model law on cross-border insolvency. So
Correct.
you basically were, stuck with practice, not the tools that we have today, and you needed to figure out how you're going to do a cross-border insolvency, multi-jurisdictional with all these issues, and come up with practical solutions that you then test with the court, and the court actually shows the English judges their commercial attitudes, and also facilitating, I guess, solutions that are found in practice.
Yeah. And there was a whole number of incredible practical things we had to deal with. And it's a very, very boring point, but in a usual group company, you have this cash sweep happens every evening, and then sort of money goes out the next day. But we had to stop all of that because we're saying, well, hang on. We may have a situation here where you've got a solvent company is effectively then funding an insolvent company. That money is not coming back. So we had to break that all up, and saying to a finance department, oh, that sort of simple system that you put in place with X bank, we can't have that anymore. You've got to do this manually now. You've got to do every one of these transactions manually. You suddenly they're having nightmares about having no money, and you're then being very particular about every single movement of money. And much of what I had to do was spending every day we appointed a sort of a group CFO and we'd run through who we could send money to. I mean, it was literally, pay a penny over there, not a penny over there, whatever. Maybe that's not a great deal of lawyering involved, but it was all part of that. Back right to the very beginning. I very much enjoyed that holistic business approach rather than just, here is the law.
Yeah. And again, it's the weirdness of, I think, insolvency is that it is single debtor focused, right? So a group is then chopped up in single debtors that
Yeah.
need to be looked at, on its own. And if they're part of a group and they've always acted as a group outside of financial distress, it is very awkward to all of a sudden change that to a single entity approach when they're in financial distress, which is why, you're sort of alluding to all these practical issues that you need to deal with. Um, I, I would like to move, to sort of, pave the way to, your move to Africa. But before we do that, I think one of the things that I'm also very interested in is your time at Jeffries, because we've seen that a number of I guess, restructuring lawyers, special sits lawyers have tried to go in-house in an investment bank or a fund or, and they do it for a little bit, but then usually they go back to private practice. There's very few, I think, exceptions to that. I've thought about that myself, at some point in time. I've never really executed on it. And I'm sort of interested in what was your experience, going the other side. Jamie Sprayregen did it in Goldman Sachs. I think, Andrew Wilkinson did it. Obviously Justin Bickel did it. And he's one of the one that sort of, stayed the course. But a lot of people just go back to, private practice. What was your experience there?
I was interested in trying because I like to sort of, I like the numbers. I guess I've been more numbers orientated. I like the business idea. So, I thought I could deliver something. But it is a very different world. And in terms of the deliverables in a sense are or the metrics of those deliverables is different. So as a lawyer, you sit there and you do X number of hours and you charge by the hour. Generally speaking, there could be some, success levels in there, and your end product is the matter is finished and it's succeeded or whatever it is. And on a restructuring, that can often be actually a very lengthy period of time. But you're charging on your monthly basis, and the financials of your firm look sensible because there you go, you've got money coming in every month. On the banking side, that the metrics are very different because it is, much more bottom line driven, and it's bottom line driven every quarter. So and I think, restructuring as an advisory type business is very difficult within a bank because the timeline, number one, is much longer. It's not a quarterly. So it's not just bond issue, bond issue, bond issue. That's quite easy. Equity raise, equity raise. Those are sort of very simple on the metrics. Restructuring is very difficult on that metric. If you're looking at it purely in a standalone advisory capacity. You're saying, well, where's your fee? And that fees tend to be back-ended, and that could be a long way away. And then there's a monthly retainer, but that doesn't really sort of, move the dial. So, to some extent, I think where restructuring practice, then they morph in a bank, it morphs into something of being, is this a conduit for some other bank product, which is, here's your restructuring. What you need is a bond issue. And that's the bond department. So they go, thank you very much, Lyndon. You've just, provided or scoped some work into that. Or, you're going to get your equity guys involved because there's some sort of equity raise or some other financing. So if you measure it that way and say, actually, the advisory bit is almost like a sideshow to the bank's main business, which is capital markets, whatever. And yeah, that is quite different. And you see institutions that, it's not restructuring for restructuring's sake. It's restructuring because it leads to, another profitable part of the bank. And yeah, my experience of it was that I was trying to look at it purely on a restructuring advisory basis, and yeah, that was a struggle.
So you need to get, I guess, a little bit of a runway to make that work.
Yeah,
And if you
and
don't
then your
get the
quarters can
runway,
be
then and the
hopefully.
pressure is there, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That was my experience, but I mean, and each institution will have its, have slightly different views of how that works, but that was my experience.
But it was a good experience to actually have seen, that bit of the practice
Oh,
inside.
yeah,
What?
yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, I think maybe my character is that no experience is a bad experience because you do or you should learn things from it. But no, it certainly was, and I think even, if nothing else, is that to understand where the bankers are coming from. And I have a great, massive respect for those that do that advisory side. But if it is a sort of a pure advisory, so not within a bigger bank institution, and we all know the firms we're speaking of. Yeah, you do need the runway in that. Then hopefully you've got X number of mandates, and they're all finishing off. Ideally, more than one per quarter, and your quarterly earnings all look very good. But at the outset, you may well have nothing for a period of time, and then it's how much there is belief or the funding for that.
Yeah. And do you think that it makes a difference that you were already a quite experienced and mature private practice lawyer by the time that you made the move, that the more sort of you're set in your ways as a private practice lawyer, the more difficult it is to adjust to a different environment like that? Should you, if you want to do that, do it earlier on in your career? Obviously the downside then is that you don't have the experience and sort of the added value that you could bring if you're more senior.
I think you do need the seniority. I think it's probably a lot more difficult if you've been in one institution, and dare I say it, if you've been in a magic circle firm for 25 odd years, let's say, because it's very comfortable. That is a very comfortable environment, and banking is not comfortable. I think I was okay with it because I'd been in effectively two different sort of startups, and so going somewhere, it's like, hey, it's all new again. But that was okay. I'd been there and done that sort of thing. But I think if you're someone who's been in part of a large institution, you're a smallish cog in a large machine, then it's quite difficult if you go somewhere and go, oh, actually, I'm the machine. I'm not the small cog in the machine. I need to be the entire machine. Um, so I think it depends on what your experience and it is, as to whether you cope with that or not.
Yeah. So how did you get from Kirkland to Cape Town? What sort of because that is a massive shift in
Yeah.
many ways, and yeah, I mean you sort of explained you were one of the pioneers in London in a very, very fast changing restructuring market. The practice area matured, became much more cross border, different players, both on the legal side, the law firms, different law firms, but also banks to private equity and distressed funds, a distressed market coming up. Lots of things happening in London. London, competing in a way with New York. Different systems, but both focused on rescue. So an awful lot going on. and then you sort of focus on, well, you're going to Africa, which is a continent that is full of promise, but quite different from the environment in London and New York. And then I guess South Africa may be Africa for beginners, but it's still Africa, and it's
Mhm.
quite different from again your sort of experience in one of the two cities of the world, London. How did that come about?
Yeah, look, I don't disagree with anything you said there. I mean, the move to South Africa was not a work decision. So I think that's the first thing. It was very much a personal decision of I felt I'd sort of done what I'd wanted to do in the city. And there was personal reasons for my thinking, well, I could carry on doing this for another 10 years or so, but that didn't look particularly attractive to me of just carry on and doing more of the same. I mean, maybe on reflection now, something new would have come along and I would have pushed the envelope again on doing something different. But I didn't really have the burning desire, drive to do that. I sort of thought I thought I'd done more than I ever thought I was going to do when I started out. So I was sort of quite contented with all of that. And then so the personal reasons were that I didn't need to be in London anymore, and sort of looking at again back to the beginning, sort of compartmentalizing up my life. There's my childhood in the countryside, and then there's London, and it sort of that was sort of done. I visited here a few times, thought it was a fantastic place. I thought this is a place for me that would be very good retirement. So that was sort of really the idea of, it was a retirement idea. And
And
then
this
whilst I
was,
was sort of
in time, this was 2015, 16,
14,
around
yeah,
that time.
14, yeah,
14, 14.
yeah. So it's like, okay, look, it's relatively early retirement, but that's okay. And yeah, how this country is, it was made retirement a lot more sort of sensible. So that was the idea. And as I was sort of planning, as you say, sort of quite a significant move to the other side of the world, um, I'd had a couple of phone calls from Bowman's of whether I'd be interested in doing something with them, which is much more sort of banking orientated actually. And I said, well, that's not really me. And actually, I don't really want to do anything anymore. But we continued those conversations for 6 odd months. I mean, it was all quite sort of, relaxed. And then we got to a point where I thought, well, okay, I'm sort of, I'm happy enough with what I've done in London. I don't need to do more than that. But yeah, maybe this is something that could be interesting. So, I very much said, you don't know me and you don't know what I do, and I don't know you or what you do, and I have no idea whether this thing might work or not. But if we can do something that you know protects each of us, there's no downside. So protect the again, here's the restructuring lawyer talking. Protect the downside, and the upside works for itself. So that's sort of what we worked something out that sort of made sense. And yeah, so yeah, very, very different, as you say. Not the levels of complication of financing by any means. Much more sort of localized. Yes, yeah, there are some things that stretch beyond the border here into Botswana and Namibia and Mozambique, etc. But not not that sort of major cross border stuff. But yeah, and I spent a number of years, and again did some interesting work. So
How was it different? All levels was different. Obviously, it's a different system than it is in the in the UK, but it's also a different market. Culturally, it's different. How did that all of that reflect in the matters that you were involved in? Was it debtor side engagements that you were continuing doing? Was it back to like helping banks, working with their NPLs? Was it, what was it?
All of the above, actually, which was a good thing. Yeah, there were a number of company side mandates. There were mandates for the government on state-owned enterprises. There were some private equity related deals, and there was a number of bank side deals as well. So that was nice to be able to sort of do everything across the spectrum. I wasn't dealing obviously with local law, but I was giving more of a sort of generic strategic advice. So it was a slightly sort of one stage removed function, which was, again, of being able to say to someone, look, this is very localized and maybe you've got 2-3 banks or one bank, whatever involved. But, my experience says that these are the ways to try and, work through these difficulties you have. Yeah, because they were not, in many cases, they just didn't have the experience of going through, a significant restructuring. Again, a lot of it was, well, okay, banks calling in their security and on you go. But if it was more complicated or the banks had some real risk, then you needed to work through a longer solution. And so it's bringing that sort of more strategic thinking rather than black letter law to it.
But was it then, almost on substance going back to the 90s? Security enforcement,
Oh yeah,
liquidation.
and that it was and is, and I just said, look, you don't need me for that stuff. I will do things that are, and this sounds terrible, but a lot more complicated or has some cross-border issues involved in it, or you've got international lenders that are going to be thinking differently, and how you organize and discipline them in the way that you want it to work for your restructuring. So I was very much that sort of more one stage removed.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe sort of the generic question that flows from that is, in special sits, what is success? Is there, a way to defining success? Obviously, it may depend on which side you are acting for. And maybe it also depends on where you are in London or in Cape Town makes a difference. What are sort of your thoughts on that?
I think success is, ideally that the company, not necessarily the company, the business or a part of that business remains, if that's a sensible thing to happen, and at the same time, that lenders have the greatest recovery they can have.
So uh, in Africa, what have been your experiences there in terms of the more complicated stuff and maybe the opportunities? Because I think one of the things that I've been struggling with in my career is Africa has been, an interest of me, forever. You may or may not know, but I was actually born in
Yeah.
Congo. So, I've been only there for a very, 6 months or something like that. But somehow it is an attachment to the continent. And I wanted to do something with, my professional experience there as well. I'm doing that through, the World Bank and missions and what have you. I always had the interest also to see, well, are there maybe distressed opportunities where you can, guide distressed investors or others, in Africa doing stuff? Actually, my experience has been it is very, very difficult because, the size of the opportunities, the complications, it's probably even more complex than, some of the situations that we have here. And the tools in the toolbox. And, maybe the most difficult is the mentality towards financial distress. The stigma is so much, bigger than it has developed, I guess, in London and New York. I wonder to what extent, you've been able to, be more successful in that than I have been since you've been 10 years, on the ground. Or, and what is your experience? Why is it so hard to find opportunities in Africa for, I guess, the distressed investors that have found their way from the US to London?
Well, I think I've spectacularly failed as well over over that 10-year period. And yeah, I can only broadly speak about South Africa rather than other countries on the continent. But I mean, here, I think there's a number of issues. There's the size of the deals is small in comparison to London or New York. So it doesn't tend to excite anyone because the just numbers are too small. Even if it was going to interest someone, and there's one or two that may get to sort of a sensible number. There's concern about FX risk, although I think the rand's been relatively stable for some time now, but that's always been a bit of a problem. And then there's exchange control issues. South Africa is one of the few countries that has exchange control. So you need to structure the deal in such a way that that the money can come out. And I think that's a real challenge. So I think those three, size of deal and then flow of deal. There's not many deal flow. So size of deal, number of deals, FX and exchange control just makes it, not necessarily too difficult, but there's other places that are much easier. So I think that's from a New York and a London perspective. And then in terms of the environment here, most deals are done with a limited number of banks. They will not break ranks with each other because they're always doing deals every single day of the year. And what those banks are not prepared to do is sell out to what they might perceive to be an aggressive or a different agenda US or UK fund, because they feel that if that happens and the deal goes in a different direction for where the other banks would like it to go, for right or for wrong, they feel that they've spoilt the party. So they may all sell out together, but you won't have one breaking ranks. So that is problematic. I have discussed with all of the banks the idea of, as we spoke of earlier, about these funds being able to create flexibility, liquidity, whatever, but that has fallen on deaf ears so far. I think there's also a level of political overlay. And by that, I mean that this is a socialist country. And there are obvious points that flow out of that, not least protection of employment. So the idea that the US or the UK would have no problems about of a major restructuring leading to sort of significant redundancies. There may be a bit of a scream in the newspaper about it for a day, but then people move on. That's a much bigger issue here. The idea of a business restructuring requires significant redundancies is going to have a lot of resistance to it, or even just killing off any business. The government's going to look and say, you bank, whether it's right or wrong, or even if it's entirely wrong, you bank caused that business to fail. You have led to the redundancy of those people, unemployment. I think banks only go there at the really very, very last position. So I think you can't underestimate that sort of government overlay that exists here. And I've certainly seen that in a whole number of cases.
So do you think that also the criminalization of financial distress is at the heart of, I guess, the lack of progress that you can make in developing a secondary market, because the mentality towards financial distress, failure, falling down, getting up, is simply not there. So the US and UK firms are not invited to actually, do business there. But also there is no homegrown development of distressed investing outfits either.
No, and so I mean, it's interesting because there have been some larger restructurings that have had some international lenders, and so some of the UK firms, US orientated, have come here, have won mandates to do stuff, and yeah, it's been a struggle because yeah, the Anglo-Saxon, if you wish to use that sort of style, is not appreciated here. Yeah, it's seen as being very aggressive. So I've I've been seen as being that, but maybe I am anyway. But it's like, oh God, yeah. Not only is it Lyndon, there's a whole horde of them. They're all the same. Uh, because they would much rather try and work things through, and that's the nature of it. And so the banks feel that they can do that because, generally speaking, for most of the restructurings, I mean, we wouldn't see them because they will do those things in house, or it'll be a bit of an amend and extend and move on. There won't be sort of really serious heavy lifting restructuring unless it's something pretty major.
In your view and experience, is that across the continent, or are there other African jurisdictions where progress is made faster than in South Africa, as far as you can see?
I don't have visibility on that. I mean, South Africa is one of the largest, or first, second, third largest economy on the continent, along with Nigeria and Egypt. I doubt that either of those has any particularly advanced system. They'll have very different local issues to address. I mean, I think here, is probably back to our easy entry to the African continent. I think doing business here is probably easier in terms of familiarity. I wouldn't say necessarily red tape, etc. But sort of what people feel comfortable with, what looks most familiar. It would be here compared to anywhere else on the continent. So yeah, there has been the odd deal, there has been the odd investment, but it's not enough to sustain a business.
Right. So we've sort of gone over a large period of time, and your experience in the restructuring market. If we sort of pause and take stock on where things are at the moment. Obviously, there seem to be a lot of geopolitics, geoeconomics, uncertainty that is across the globe at the moment. It has, a huge impact on, you know, professions as well, including, I guess, our special sit space too. We seem to thrive in uncertainty. That is what we do. But there needs to be a little bit of certainty as well, and to get started. And now there seems to be an awful lot of additional uncertainty layered on top of the uncertainty that financial distress brings with it. That makes it probably more difficult to, get things done. Uh, um, Looking at the crystal ball, do you think that this is going to continue? Is this just a phase? And where do you think things are going? In our profession, as it has developed up until today.
Oh, that's a really simple question. It's,
I like simple and concise questions.
yeah, look, I mean, I think that there are, I mean, all, tariffs, real or threatened, or, and for whatever reason behind them, whether, economic or political, etc., is clearly, another added factor for a whole number of businesses. And that's, well outside of, what's manageable in terms of any restructuring. Whether, and that's clearly going to affect, people's revenue streams for certain businesses. Whatever knock-on effects that may then have to inflation and therefore interest rates. I mean, again, I think it is all incredibly uncertain. I'm sure you can get 50 different opinions from 30 different economists, on that. So I think sort of the macroeconomic position is probably more uncertain than we've had for a very, very long time. I mean, even post 2008, people all understood what that was, and with all the quantitative easing, in COVID, people understood what that was, and I think people could, produce models to, what the outcomes of that were. I think it is all a lot more difficult now, and we just don't know. When there's threats of 10%, 25%, whatever Trump thinks of, the next day, that's if they play out, and maybe even wider repercussions of his policy decisions, that's I think problematic. I think as other sort of wider issues. I mean, we spoke right at the beginning about sort of the big cases in the past were fraud. I mean, I think famous last words. Maybe we're seeing less of that because of maybe better regulation, although regulation tends to lag quite a long way behind circumstances, and governance issues. I think continued improvement of governance issues. But I mean, I think trying to be, this is somewhat meant to be sarcastic, an optimistic restructuring guy. Human beings are always greedy, and when there's greed, that will lead to people cutting corners. And I think, have we seen the end of greed? Certainly not. Have we seen the end of over leveraging? No, at lots of different levels. And so those two things alone, and the fact that regulation always lacks behind, there will be situations arise, and they come around with incredible irregularity. Whether dot coms, all of the bubble of dot coms, I think the various bubbles plus frauds in crypto, easy money floating around numerous times. That will, I think, mean that businesses will fail. And sometimes just fundamentally bad businesses and or bad management. And I think without being a bit of a doom monger about it, AI and all of its iterations, that could over the next X period of time, lead to significant differences in how businesses are run, including our own. I mean, I think we always think that every job could be overtaken by AI except our own. I'm not sure whether a Peter or Lyndon robot can sit in a room and rant about restructurings. Maybe it is, but a lot of the groundwork of what we do, a lot of the analysis of the debt instruments or the permutations, that could be all plugged in pretty quickly. So I think the sort of the lower levels of legal work, lower levels of financial analysis work, that can all be done automated.
But well, I don't necessarily disagree, but isn't at the core of what we do also, the human factor in it, right? Making assessments, not necessarily only on, numbers and facts, but also the humans that are involved. And that is, I guess, a lot more difficult for me to see that an AI can actually do that. So they can be a great tool for people like you and me to be better able to do our job. But can they ultimately, give that, assessment that is required? Or do you think actually, the human factor isn't that big? It can all be automated anyway.
No, look, I hope there's a human factor issue still there. Whether you say it's because, I mean, the views are what professions are less likely to be taken over. One of those is sort of creative type professions and caring, nursing type professions. And stretching that, I would say that restructuring people are both creative and caring. So maybe we win on both counts there. That there's things that we can still do. But I think one of the concerns I have is that you know when you're long in the tooth and you can bring all that experience, then I think there is a function for us. Whether a lot of that, you know 10, 20, 30, 40 years or whatever experience can be, you know, put into some sort of, memo that's produced in 5 seconds. Yeah, maybe. But I still think it's different of staring someone in the face. And there's a bit of a poker game that happens. And, again, not sure all of that can be done. But I do wonder how someone starting today gets to where you or I are, because I think that path is going to be very, very different. I don't. Yeah, I think a junior person won't go through the same experiences that we have. So what does that person look like in 20, 30 years' time?
Yeah, the reps that you've done, I've done, starting in banking, doing the tedious sort of, documentation, you do learn a lot from it, right?
Mm,
And if you do litigation, you do some corporate work, it all features into, the specialization that you and I do. And then I guess if you have some experience with startup situations, anything sort of, entrepreneurial, seems to also assist understanding the clients that you're dealing with in your own practice. How that all is going to be done. I mean, yeah, maybe there is a change required in law school, in education, but also within the law firms. How do you basically educate junior people? And can you
right.
educate them by bringing them into matters where ultimately the client is paying for the education, right? Which,
Yeah.
again, is a very sensitive issue as well. It's the leverage model of law firms. And, does that work, especially if we're doing it only on an hourly rate? Can we not do it, on an hourly rate? How do you assess it? It's tricky. Um, what do you think is required to unlock the potential that maybe the African continent has in special situations? Is there anything that you've seen in the 10 years that you're there that you think, look, if that actually is tweaked or that is encouraged, we're going to make progress. It's going to take time, but it is possible. Or do you say, look, I've tried 10 years, ran into a brick wall, and it's tricky. I actually don't see yet how it is going to be unlocked.
I think it is difficult. Yeah, maybe people will have more success than I have. I think there is a role there, and I think it's a question of, back to, I think funds can provide flexibility and liquidity, and your traditional banks can move on and lend you money somewhere else at at lower rates than any fund would. But it's a question of, it's a tried and tested process, a sort of suck it and see that, it's allowing someone in, and that they don't go crazy, and that, a bank can then see the benefits of that. Then I think they'd be prepared to do it a second, third, or fourth time. I think they've sort of heard horror stories, and again, I think, not only that, but a fund is not going to be constrained by the political pressures that may exist, with banking institutions here. So I think, unless there's a fundamental change. So I think it's two parts. I think there need to be change it sort of in terms of government approach to business, and also the bank institutions here, willing to take that risk, which is a difficult issue, right? Willing to take the risk of allowing or funds in, and again, speaking to those funds on that side of going, look, don't treat this. Have respect for the local culture. Don't treat this like an English or a New York restructuring. Be sensitive to the parameters here, and then you'll be invited back. but come in, and do what you traditionally do, which is all totally acceptable in London, etc., will just go down spectacularly badly here, and you'll come once and not again.
Yeah. So what's the trigger then? Do you think that maybe the leverage lies with institutions like the World Bank that can, in a productive way and an encouraging way, put sufficient pressure on the government to actually, facilitate an environment where, a foreign investor of whatever type or a non-bank investor is allowed to come in, and that sort of tests the viability of a distressed market, because it's not going to be, well, yeah, or how, or do you need to go directly, do you and I, or practitioners need to lobby with banks to do it? But again, if there's no stick for them to do it, why would they do it? How do you sort of, what's the tipping point? Where does it change? Who has the leverage? Is it at the
Yeah,
supranational level?
Yeah, and I'm not sure with that, because I think, look, in the past, when countries have experienced difficulties and they've needed IMF support, then the IMF always sets conditions for that. But we're not there with that, and I mean, and even if we were, then those conditions are all at a fiscal level about tax rates and etc. It's not going to be, local banks A, B, C, and D need to be more open to, secondary investors. So I don't think it can work at that level. It has to be with those banks that understand that there is a benefit to them, for allowing these institutions in. And I think at the moment they may see some, theoretical benefit, but what they see is much more tangible risk, and that balance hasn't tipped for them. They can
Yeah.
work it out. They have enough funds. The banks here, are well funded. And even back, if you look at 2007-8, the banks didn't struggle here because they basically were doing deals at 2, 3, 4 times levered. They weren't doing deals at 6, 8, 10 times levered. So, they've not had that level of risk, and they're still, they still do not lend at anywhere near those levels. So, the banks feel pretty comfortable with where they are. They have enough, and I mean, I've made a bit of a joke of going, well, they sell at a discount. So, okay, they've got to mark that anyway, and then they've got this pile of cash to go and lend somewhere else. They haven't really got anywhere else to lend it, to be honest. They lent what they need to, what they can. They don't need, as far as I see, more cash. So they don't need to free that up to go and do something else. So there's just not the underlying drivers to change it.
So last year, you took the drastic step to announce publicly that you had retired. Surely somebody like you and me and in our profession, we can never retire, right? Because you've actually been in the space for such a long time. I mean, can you retire, or is it something that you're still available to help out, because you've acquired so much expertise and experience that can still be useful for situations? Or have you said, look, enough is enough, there's tons of other things that I want to do, and finally I'm going to get time to do it? What's sort of your perspective on that?
Yeah. So look, I mean, I guess I privately retired 10 years ago and then didn't. So the public declaration is hopefully a sort of a firmer line in the sand that I can't kick over. I wouldn't say never. Look, I think it's something that I thought was very interesting. I like finance, I like economics, I like business. that's never going to change. I do have plenty of spare time, which is a nice thing. Back to what we were talking earlier, we're always very time poor whilst we're working, so it's nice to have that. I would be open if someone came along and I thought whatever it was, whereas short term or longer term, was a very interesting project. I guess it would be that. Then I would always be happy to have that conversation because um, I like doing this. Equally, um, I'm always happy to do this sort of thing and have chats with people, uh, junior people that are in law schools, etc. To have those conversations either on a formal basis that I'm thinking about, or more informally, which I've done from time to time, because I always think it's helpful, not necessarily guidance, but if you speak to someone, you can listen or not listen, take it on board or not. But it's better to have heard someone rather than not, and making decisions entirely in a void. So I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. So, you've been today extremely generous with your time, and I'm very grateful for that. And there is, again, we've only touched upon a number of things that we can go into much more detail, but maybe with sort of the lessons learned that are helpful for maybe younger people that are listening to this and considering, yeah, maybe special sits is an area that I want to pursue a career in. What are, based on your experience, some key lessons learned that are relevant to sort of share with maybe younger and older people that are listening? Because you're never too old to learn something from experiences from others, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I think that holistic approach, that there isn't a single solution. It's likely to be a whole number of factors. So keep as broad a mind as possible. Um, have an interest as broadly as possible, and bring all of that to the table. Um, and again, a silly point maybe to end. You have one mouth and two ears, and use them proportionately.
Yeah. And what about, because you said it a number of times, and it is so, part and parcel, of our space special sits, you know, failure. How do you need to deal with failure if you want to have longevity in this space? I have my personal views on this, that I've learned a lot more from things that didn't go the way I planned than when they did. And it makes you a much richer person if you live to tell the tale, right? Because what doesn't break you makes you stronger. But
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. The words. What does success mean? Because there can be a lot of problems in supposed success and progress. And what does failure mean? Um, maybe there is no such thing as failure. It's an experience, and maybe it's pretty unpleasant at the time. But if you learn from that, then you do progress, to use a word again that's a strange whatever definition. But I think don't say things are a failure. Look, it's maybe more difficult to work around that word if you start a business and it closes. Is that failure? Maybe it is. I think if you start a business and you repay any lenders, then maybe you've just closed the door. And even if you've spent the money that an investor has given you and they don't get their return, I think investors generally know that, VCs, etc. So again, I'm not quite sure that's a failure. They have taken that risk, and that risk didn't pay off. But you talk to them nicely, and they appreciate that you were trying something that might have been that moonshot for them. So again, I'm not even sure that's a failure. You say, here's something I'm trying. it's 1,000,000 to 1, whatever. They're willing to invest in the 1,000,000 to 1. Guess what? They don't get it back. I'm still not sure that's a failure. You learn from that and you have model 2, model 3, model 4, whatever. I sort of think of a book I was reading a while back about James Dyson and his vacuum cleaner thing. That wasn't model 1 that worked. It was model, God knows what it was, 28 or
Exactly.
something or more. So
No, 500. It's a lot, or even
yeah,
more than
were
that.
all the others failures? I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure categorizing something as failure is, well, it's not helpful. I think it's actually detrimental. And so you say, look, stuff happens, and you get something out of it. And as long as you can get something out of it without too much damage to yourself at a personal level, then I don't think that's a failure. You can almost say
Yeah.
that's a success, and it moves you to the next level.
Yeah. In my mind, like, there's only one failure. There's failure to really try, right? Because
Mm.
if you just put
Or
in the
give up.
effort, but
Give up.
yeah, exactly. We can fall, but we need to focus on, standing up. Uh, um, Look, Lyndon, I think you've had a tremendous journey. I'm hoping that the journey will still continue. I hope there are ways for us to still do things together in the profession or outside. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast today, and thanks very much for sharing all your thoughts.
Thank you very much, and I hope it doesn't traumatize people too much that are going to listen to this.
To the contrary. Thanks very much,
Thank you very much, Peter.
Lyndon.
Pleasure as always.